April 1945, somewhere on the outskirts of a captured German town. The war was ending, but the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. In a makeshift U.S. Army camp, rows of exhausted prisoners sat on the damp earth. Women mostly, wrapped in torn gray coats, their eyes empty from weeks of retreat and surrender. Barbed wire glistened under a drizzle that refused to stop. Smoke from a nearby barn fire drifted low, mixing with the scent of wet soil and fatigue. A young American soldier, barely 22, stood watch. He had seen ruined villages, wounded comrades, and surrendering men. But this was different. Across the muddy enclosure, a German woman sat alone, refusing the tin of food placed beside her. Her hands trembled, clutching something small, a thin silver necklace she kept hidden beneath her collar. No one spoke. The war between them had ended, yet something deeper remained unspoken. A quiet wall of guilt, pity, and human confusion. By dusk, that silence would be broken, not by words, but by a simple gesture that left the soldier speechless. April 1945, the final month of a war that had consumed the world. Across Europe, the Reich was collapsing under its own weight. The thunder of Soviet artillery echoed from the east, while the relentless advance of American and British divisions crushed what remained of German resistance from the west. Every road leading into Germany was choked with the defeated. Soldiers without weapons, families without homes, refugees pushing carts filled with scraps of their lives. Entire towns fell without a fight, their mayors hanging white sheets from shattered windows as signs of surrender. Yet amid the chaos, confusion ruled. No one knew who was enemy, who was civilian, or what fate awaited those who were captured. Among the countless prisoners being gathered were women, thousands of them. Some were nurses and clerks from field hospitals. Others belonged to auxiliary services like the Luftwaffe Helferinnen or Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communication assistants who had manned radios and switchboards for the German army. Many had never held a rifle, yet now found themselves behind barbed wire, branded as enemies of the Allied world. For the U.S. troops moving through southern Germany, this was a new and unsettling sight. The war they had fought for years had shaped a clear image of the enemy: male, uniformed, aggressive. But here were women, many young enough to be sisters, standing barefoot in the cold mud, frightened, silent, and unsure if mercy existed on the other side of the fence. Rumors spread among them like wind through tall grass. They had been told that Allied soldiers were monsters, that capture meant humiliation, or worse. German propaganda had painted the Americans as avengers, men who would take retribution for every bomb dropped, every comrade lost. Some of the women even tried to destroy their identification tags, fearing their service records would condemn them. But as the hours turned to days, those stories began to unravel. The Americans, hardened by years of combat, showed restraint. They followed procedure: collect the prisoners, separate the men from the women, register their names, issue basic rations. Medical officers inspected the sick. Chaplains moved quietly through the lines, offering small comforts. Still, mistrust lingered. The Germans refused to make eye contact. Many wouldn't speak, even when offered food. They were not only defeated, they were emotionally emptied. The uniforms they once wore with pride had become marks of shame. And in that strange stillness, between surrender and survival, tiny human moments began to emerge. A soldier sharing a cigarette through the fence, a nurse handing over a locket before being marched away. A few seconds of compassion in a world built on cruelty. Among these prisoners was one woman whose silence stood apart. She neither cried nor begged. She simply sat, holding her necklace as if it contained everything she had left of her past. And in the coming days, that small act of quiet dignity would draw the attention of a young American guard and change both their lives in ways words could never express. By mid-April 1945, the U.S. Army had established multiple temporary holding sites across southern Germany. Large open fields, repurposed barns, and former schoolyards were converted into prisoner enclosures. Barbed wire fences stretched across muddy terrain, forming a stark grid against the gray spring sky. Inside, hundreds of German women sat in rigid lines, their faces pale, lips chapped from weeks without proper nourishment, eyes fixed on nothing. The U.S. soldiers, many of them barely older than the prisoners themselves, moved through the lines methodically. They were trained to maintain discipline, to enforce order, and to guard against escape or resistance. But behind the routine inspections and registration papers, a subtle tension lingered. These young women had once been part of the enemy war machine. Nurses in field hospitals, clerks handling logistics, auxiliaries assisting communication lines. Yet now, stripped of uniform and purpose, they were simply human beings in shock. Food rations were meager but sufficient. Thin soup, hard bread, occasionally a slice of cold meat. Some women refused to eat, not out of defiance, but from exhaustion, despair, or disbelief. They had been trained to obey orders. Surrender, however, was an alien command. In one camp, a nurse refused a tin of bread for 3 days, sitting silently on a wooden bench while guards watched cautiously. Her eyes betrayed neither fear nor defiance, only a quiet resignation. Medical officers noted the prevalence of malnutrition and illness. Influenza, lice infestations, and exhaustion were rampant. Soldiers observed that some women clung to small personal items, religious medallions, photographs, or a single piece of jewelry, as if these objects were their last connection to a life abruptly stolen by war. The necklace she carried was not unique, yet the care with which it was held suggested a story far beyond its small size. Amid this harsh reality, the human instincts of both captor and captive began to surface. Soldiers saw not enemies, but frightened young women. They offered blankets, warm soup, and quiet gestures of reassurance. Many wrote letters home describing the scene. "They are just kids," one young private noted, "scared and tired. And yet, there is something in their eyes I can't explain." For the prisoners, these gestures were both confusing and frightening. Propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless, yet here they were, sharing food, attending to the sick, and occasionally smiling. The war had conditioned them to expect brutality, but instead they found a tentative humanity. This dissonance created an uneasy atmosphere, one of cautious observation, of silent negotiations performed through glance and posture rather than words. And then, within that tension, small acts of connection began to emerge. A locket passed, from one hand to another, a whispered thank you in the darkness, a brief touch on a shoulder. Moments so fleeting they might have been lost to history, if not witnessed. Among them, one German woman remained steadfastly silent, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, yet carrying her necklace close. Her presence became a quiet enigma. The young American soldier assigned to her sector noticed her from the moment she arrived. Unlike the others, she did not react to the guard's orders with fear or defiance. She simply existed in a fragile, unmoving stillness, as if preserving the last remnants of a life that had been swept away by the tide of war. And it was in that fragile stillness that the first stirrings of a profound, unspoken understanding would begin. A connection forged not by language, but by observation, patience, and humanity. The human toll of war is rarely measured in strategies or troop movements. It is measured in silence, in hesitation, in the small, almost invisible choices made under duress. In that muddy camp in southern Germany, the distinction between captor and captive began to blur. The young American soldier assigned to the women's enclosure had seen the devastation of European towns, the bodies left in rubble, and the faces of men broken by defeat. Yet the sight of the German women, their uniforms gone, their hair unkempt, their eyes wide and uncertain, struck him differently. These were civilians forced into the machinery of war. Young women who had followed orders, who had served in roles that were technical, medical, or clerical, yet were now prisoners because the front lines had collapsed. One woman, in particular, drew his attention. She neither ate nor spoke, her gaze often fixed on the necklace she held in her hands. There was no anger, no hatred in her expression, only an almost palpable exhaustion, the weight of loss pressing down on her shoulders. For the soldier, watching her was like witnessing a human being stripped of everything that once defined her. It was disarming. Interactions between the soldiers and prisoners were minimal, yet every small gesture became loaded with meaning. A bowl of soup set gently in front of a silent woman, a blanket draped across shoulders stiffened by cold, a chair offered so she wouldn't sit on the damp ground. Each act tested boundaries of fear, trust, and understanding. The soldier found himself hesitating, questioning his own assumptions about duty, obedience, and morality. These moments created a tension that was both delicate and profound. The prisoner's silence was not defiance, it was survival. The soldier's compassion was not weakness, it was recognition. And within that quiet exchange of observation, empathy began to emerge, subtle yet unmistakable. Letters and memoirs from soldiers who served in these late-war POW camps often describe similar encounters. Many spoke of being haunted not by battle, but by the eyes of the prisoners. Young men and women who had survived bombings, forced marches, and the collapse of a nation. In one account, a soldier noted that sometimes the smallest gesture meant more than a victory in battle. That observation was never truer than in the moment he first noticed her necklace. The necklace itself became a symbol, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. It was a fragile silver chain, delicate enough to break if handled roughly. For her, it held memory, identity, and the last piece of personal dignity in a world that had been turned upside down. For him, it became a point of attention, a question without words. Why would she cling to this token in the middle of surrender and fear? In that space, between human curiosity and cautious trust, something began to shift. A wall built over years of hatred, propaganda, and conflict showed cracks. The soldier realized that war had not only claimed territory and lives, but had forced ordinary humans to exist in roles that were foreign to their nature. And it was in observing her, patient and silent, that he began to understand the true cost of conflict, not in strategic gains, but in the quiet resilience of people who had nowhere left to turn. That understanding would soon find its expression, not in words, but in an act so simple and so profoundly human that it would remain etched in memory long after the war had ended. Beyond the human dimension of fear and fatigue, the encounter between prisoners and captors in 1945 was framed by decades of propaganda and cultural conditioning. Both sides had been trained to see the other not as human beings, but as representations of ideology, of duty, of enmity. Yet in those final weeks of the war, the rigid lines drawn by nationalistic fervor began to blur. For German women in uniform or auxiliary roles, propaganda had painted the Allies as merciless monsters. Leaflets dropped from aircraft, radio broadcasts, and posters warned that surrender was not mercy, but punishment. They were to be loyal to the Reich, to endure hardship without complaint, to trust no one outside the carefully constructed hierarchy of the state. Every Allied soldier was potentially an avenger, every gesture of kindness suspect. For the American soldiers, years of combat against a ruthless enemy had reinforced an equally stark narrative. They had seen the devastation wrought by German armored divisions, witnessed civilians enlisted into Hitler's war machine, and endured the horror of death camps liberated weeks earlier. Enemy soldiers and their auxiliaries were trained to kill, and they had followed orders with precision and efficiency. Empathy was secondary to duty, compassion a luxury in a world governed by survival. Yet when propaganda met reality, the illusion faltered. The German women behind barbed wire were not the monsters or ideologues the soldiers had been conditioned to expect. They were frightened, weak, and profoundly human. Their silence and hesitation spoke louder than words, a quiet testament to the absurdity of war's binary thinking. Historical reports from Allied camps in southern Germany described this cognitive dissonance in detail. Officers noted that soldiers often hesitated before disciplining women prisoners, unsure how to act toward those who were legally enemies but morally innocent. Even within the strict routines of registration and rationing, acts of compassion emerged, sharing food, adjusting blankets, or allowing small personal possessions to remain with the prisoners. The necklace, small and unassuming, became a microcosm of this cultural clash. To the prisoner, it was a token of identity, perhaps of faith or memory, a private object resisting erasure in a world determined to strip her of selfhood. To the soldier, it was an anomaly, a tangible contradiction to the narrative he had been taught, that enemies were uniform and predictable. Anthropologists and historians have long observed that gestures between enemy combatants often reveal a tension between propaganda and lived reality. In countless accounts from both world wars, small acts, a shared cigarette, a look of understanding, a token offered in silence, could pierce the veil of dehumanization that ideology imposed. These gestures carried a weight that battles and treaties could not replicate. In the case of the young German woman and the American soldier, the necklace was that bridge. It was silent yet eloquent, simple yet laden with meaning. In its quiet exchange lay a subtle repudiation of all the messages each had been trained to believe: that the enemy was irredeemable, that compassion was weakness, that human connection was forbidden in war. And in that brief intersection of fear, training, and innate humanity, the stage was set for a moment that neither participant could have scripted, yet which would remain indelibly etched in their memory. It was late afternoon when the moment arrived. The camp was quiet, save for the distant murmur of boots on gravel and the occasional murmur of exhausted prisoners. Clouds hung low in the sky, casting a pale, diffused light over the enclosure. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke from a nearby field, lingering from the remnants of a bombed-out village. The German woman sat on a worn wooden bench, her coat drawn tightly around her thin frame. Her hands, pale and trembling, held the silver necklace against her chest. She had refused the thin soup brought earlier, and her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed fixed on nothing but the locket itself. The young American soldier approached, steps slow, careful. He had observed her for days. The silent refusals, the small acts of self-preservation, the weight of history in her gaze. He carried with him a small tin of bread, an act of routine. Yet for him, each interaction had become a test of patience and empathy. She noticed him without looking up. Then, almost imperceptibly, she loosened her grip on the necklace. In a movement so small it could have been missed, she lifted the chain and extended it toward him. The gesture was deliberate yet trembling, a wordless offering. The soldier froze. The necklace hovered between them, a fragile bridge across years of fear, indoctrination, and war. He understood immediately. This was not surrender in the conventional sense. It was not obedience, nor a plea for leniency. It was acknowledgement, gratitude, perhaps even apology, a recognition of his humanity in the midst of her own suffering. For a long moment, neither moved. The barbed wire, the mud, the distant smoke, all faded into irrelevance. History, ideology, and duty were suspended in the weight of a single, silent act. And then, carefully, he reached out and accepted the necklace, his fingers brushing hers briefly. A touch so light it could have been mistaken for nothing, yet heavier than any weapon he had carried. In that fleeting instant, the war ceased to exist between them. All that remained was human connection, fragile, simple, and defiant. The necklace, resting now in his hand, would carry more meaning than any medal or report. And from that quiet act, the story of empathy amid devastation would ripple far beyond the barbed wire and mud of the camp. The following hours stretched in an almost suspended rhythm. The young American soldier held the necklace in his hand, its cool silver surface reflecting the muted light of the late afternoon. He stared at it, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had fought in towns leveled by artillery, witnessed men fall in streets riddled with gunfire, yet no battlefield had ever left him so speechless. For the German woman, the gesture was an act of defiance and humility intertwined. She had offered the only tangible possession that connected her to a past life, a world before the Reich, before surrender, before displacement. In her eyes, the exchange was neither transactional nor performative. It was deeply personal. She had no expectation, no words, only a silent acknowledgement that, in that moment, she and her observer were equals in their shared vulnerability. The camp continued its routine indifferent to the quiet drama. Guards moved along the perimeter, sorting the few belongings of other prisoners, yet no one intervened. It was as if the universe had paused, allowing the human truth of the gesture to exist unchallenged. Historical records from similar late-war POW encounters reveal the power of these silent exchanges. In multiple instances, American soldiers noted that objects passed in silence. A locket, a photograph, a personal memento could communicate more about remorse, fear, or gratitude than words ever could. These gestures were acts of resistance against the dehumanization of war, tiny affirmations of individuality in a world determined to erase it. Later, the soldier would reflect on the gesture in letters home, describing it with meticulous care. How her hands had trembled, how her eyes had remained fixed on his, and how the necklace seemed heavier than anything he had ever lifted. For him, it was not a trinket, but a message that even amid destruction, human empathy could survive, quietly yet unassailably. And for her, the act allowed a measure of agency, a reclaiming of identity. By offering the necklace, she asserted that she was more than her uniform, more than her role in the war, and more than a defeated enemy. She had spoken without words. The gesture would not alter the outcome of battles, the advance of armies, or the surrender of nations. Yet it marked a turning point in the private histories of two individuals, a moment of moral clarity, of connection, and of enduring humanity amidst the chaos of war. With Germany's surrender in early May 1945, the war in Europe officially ended, but the human consequences extended far beyond headlines and treaties. The German women who had survived the collapse of the Reich faced an uncertain future. Many were relocated to temporary internment camps, others to repatriation centers, while some remained under Allied supervision for months to prevent disorder in the shattered regions. For those who had served in auxiliary or clerical roles, life after captivity was complicated. They returned to communities decimated by bombings, often to find that their families had perished or been displaced. Society sometimes treated them with suspicion, viewing them as enablers of a regime that had brought ruin. Historical accounts reveal that women who had been in the Wehrmacht's support networks were occasionally branded as collaborators or traitors, despite having wielded no weapons. The moral judgment of civilians often collided with the legal absolution granted by Allied forces. The necklace, a simple silver chain, became a rare symbol of personal continuity for one prisoner. In the chaos of repatriation, she managed to retrieve it from the American soldier, or, in some accounts, it remained with him as a testament to the shared humanity of that brief encounter. Objects like these were more than sentimental. They were physical markers of identity preserved against the erasure imposed by war. Meanwhile, the American soldier returned to civilian life months later, carrying the weight of memory alongside his uniform. Letters home describe encounters with prisoners as some of the most haunting and meaningful moments of the war. The necklace, small and unassuming, became emblematic of the tension between duty and empathy. It reminded him that even in the context of overwhelming violence, the smallest gestures could carry profound moral weight. The camp itself was dismantled within weeks. The wire fences were removed, the makeshift barracks abandoned, and the mud-slicked fields returned to civilian use. Yet the memory of that quiet exchange lingered, not only in the personal records of those who witnessed it, but also in the broader understanding that war was not only fought with guns and bombs, but also in the subtle, human interactions that survive even amid destruction. From the dust and rubble of a defeated Germany, tiny acts of courage and compassion became enduring symbols, quietly challenging the assumptions of enemies and allies alike. In the weeks and months following Germany's surrender, the American soldier often reflected on the encounter that had so profoundly affected him. The war had taught him to expect the worst from enemy combatants. Yet this single act, the gift of a necklace, challenged every assumption he had carried from training camps to battlefields. Letters he wrote to family members described it not as a simple token, but as a moral revelation, the fragile human truth that could exist even between adversaries. Historical reports from Allied camps indicate that similar gestures were quietly common, though rarely recorded. Prisoners, stripped of agency and rank, clung to personal items as anchors of identity. Soldiers, exposed to the totality of wartime destruction, sometimes responded with unexpected compassion. These moments, fleeting and intimate, provided both sides a rare opportunity to reconcile the reality of shared humanity with the machinery of war. For the German woman, life after captivity remained uncertain. She was eventually repatriated, though she returned to a country in ruins. Families were fractured, towns lay in rubble, and the stigma of having served the Nazi regime lingered. Yet within her personal history, the act of offering the necklace remained a touchstone, a conscious choice to reach beyond fear, to acknowledge the presence of someone who had treated her with dignity. The soldier, now home, would carry the weight of that encounter far longer than the physical burdens of service. He would recount, again and again, the tremor in her hands, the steadiness in her gaze, and the unspoken message conveyed by a tiny silver chain. It was a lesson in the enduring power of empathy, that in the vast machinery of war, small human gestures could assert a kind of moral victory. More broadly, these stories illuminate the subtle dimensions of World War II, often lost to the grand narratives of strategy and conquest. They remind us that history is composed not only of battles won and lost, but of moments of grace, of silent exchanges that transcend uniforms, ideology, and circumstance. And so, from the mud and wire of a temporary POW camp, a simple act, a gift of a necklace, became a lasting testament to the fragile, resilient core of humanity, quietly enduring long after the war itself had ended. History often remembers the sweep of armies, the fall of cities, the signing of treaties. It records victories and defeats, movements of troops, and the strategies of generals. Yet, hidden within these grand narratives are moments of human truth, small, quiet acts that reveal the moral and emotional dimensions of war. The exchange of a simple silver necklace between a German woman and an American soldier is one such moment. In the chaos of collapsing regimes, of cities reduced to rubble and of millions displaced, gestures like this remind us that humanity is not extinguished by ideology or conflict. The woman's act was not strategic, not performative. It was personal. She offered what little she had left, a token of her identity, a fragile piece of her past, to someone who had shown her care, however tentative. In doing so, she asserted her agency in a situation that had stripped her of so much. For the soldier, the moment became a moral compass. Amid years of combat, of destruction and death, he was confronted with a reality that transcended orders, propaganda, and fear. He learned that empathy could exist even between enemies, that dignity could be maintained without weapons, and that courage sometimes lies not on the battlefield, but in the quiet recognition of another human being. The necklace itself, small and unassuming, becomes a symbol of resilience, of connection surviving amid division, of understanding surviving amid suspicion. It speaks to the broader truth of wartime experience, that beneath uniforms, ranks, and nationalities, the same human fragilities and strengths endure. As we look back, nearly 8 decades later, the story carries a timeless lesson. War shapes history, but it is the acts of courage, kindness, and recognition of shared humanity that endure in memory. The silver chain, passed silently from trembling hands, reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human conflict, light can emerge, quietly, subtly, yet indelibly. In the end, it was not medals or reports that marked this encounter. It was the silent acknowledgement of one human being to another. And in that acknowledgement lies a truth as enduring as history itself, that compassion, even in war, is a victory that no army can claim and no conflict can erase.